Okay, I think we'll get started. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. This is the second in our occasional online lecture series that we're calling An Evening with Archaeopress. If you're not familiar with Archaeopress, we're an academic publisher, an independent academic publisher. We're based in Oxford, and we specialise in publishing on all areas of archaeology and related heritage-based topics. And tonight we're really delighted and very grateful to be joined by Billy O'Brien, who's a Professor of Archaeology at University College Cork in Ireland. And we've worked on several projects with Billy and both his colleagues and students over the years. And he's here tonight to talk about the latest, which is about the Garranes ring fort in County Cork. And the book, which I'm going to wave again at you now, Garranes, an early medieval royal site in southwest Ireland, is available on our website as a free download in our open access section. And it's also available, as you can see, in this very handsome hardback edition. And you can get 25% off the printed edition or any of our other books using the voucher code that I sent you yesterday, and I will send that around again when I send the YouTube link, which I'll come back to in a moment. So I'm going to activate Billy's feed now and then hand over to him. Here he is. Excellent. So Billy, when you're ready, over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you very much, Patrick, for that introduction and all your help with this, and welcome everybody. The subject, as Patrick has said, of this talk is a recent publication by Archaeopress of a research project that I have been undertaking with my collaborator, Nick Hogan. Nick Hogan is my, the two of us put together this monograph, and many other people contributed, and I'll mention them in the course of the talk. But I suppose to begin with, I just want to convey my thanks to David Davison and the team at Archaeopress for the support they gave to this project. I know many of you are from other countries, but in Ireland, it's very difficult to get support for a research publication. It really is a problem. And Archaeopress are playing an increasingly important role at a European level in terms of promoting research. I know you know this, but I just want to express my appreciation of that and the help that they have given. And of course, goes without saying that they're not responsible for the content. So, Garranes. Well, first of all, as some of you are obviously from outside of Ireland, just to explain what part of the world we're talking about, on the far left there, you have a satellite image of Ireland. We're talking about the southwestern part of Ireland, the county of Cork. And about 50 miles from Cork City is this landscape called Garranes, which I'm going to talk about. It's a complex of early medieval monuments dating mostly to the 5th and 6th centuries, from the transition from the late Iron Age to the early medieval period. Now, mentioning that reminds me to say that, of course, one of the things that makes the early medieval period in Ireland very distinctive is its Iron Age background. Because, of course, as the map on the right shows you, Ireland was not part of the Roman Empire. And that creates a number of very distinctive features of the early medieval period going forward. Of course, the Romans knew a lot about Ireland, going back to the early centuries BC, in fact. And during the period of Roman Britain, from the 1st to the 5th century AD, there's much evidence of contact between the two islands. Some of that was connected with trade, some of it was on a political level, social level, raiding, military. And we have quite a lot of Roman material in Ireland, but it's all to do with those different patterns of contact between the 1st to the 5th century AD. While Ireland was not part of the empire, it was certainly within its cultural force field. And Romanitas, various expressions of Romanitas come forward in the record. And of course, that culminates very much in the 5th century with probably the most enduring cultural influence in all, and that is the transmission of Christianity to Ireland from Roman Britain and from the Roman world. And so the place we're looking at is very much part of that whole scene, that important transition in the 5th and 6th century from essentially prehistoric Ireland to medieval Ireland. Now, society in early medieval Ireland, well, first of all, I just have to make a few general points about the nature of society in early medieval Ireland. And of course, we have historical sources here. The early medieval period, I suppose, strictly speaking, began with the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century. And with that came Latinate literacy. I don't think you could say we have real historical sources prior to probably the 7th century, even though there are records. But from the 7th century on, there are very strong analytic and other sources that give us a strong insight into what early medieval Ireland looked like in political and social terms. Now, in early medieval Ireland, we're looking at a society that is politically fragmented from the early centuries of the 5th, 6th, 7th century, and gradually, I think, becomes more centralized and at a political level from the 8th century onwards. In political terms, the actual, in political terms, the basic unit of a political unit of society was called the tua. Now, that's sometimes referred to as a tribe, but it's not really. It actually refers to a people that have a geographic expression in the form of a petty kingdom. If you like, a tua is a fusion of kinship ties and territory. Tua could be quite small. In fact, it's believed in the early medieval period that at any given time there could have been as many as 150 tua, or in other words, 150 small petty kingdoms. But as we'll see, the Irish royal kingdom of the early medieval period isn't really comparable to what you would call royal kingdoms in Britain or Europe at the same time. So very small, really. But then these tua did come together. They did coalesce into larger tua and became over kingdoms. And in fact, above that, we also have provincial kingdoms from, I suppose, the 8th century onwards. And these provincial kingdoms are very powerful. Now, the historical sources that we have for the early medieval period paint a picture of this time as being aristocratic and hierarchical. It's a very class-based society. Important distinction comes out in the annals and laws from people who are noble, sacred, the Nemid, as they are called, and the others, the non-Nemid. The Nemid class in early medieval Ireland comprised an aristocracy of lords and kings, as well as noble professions, learned castes, and ecclesiastical figures. We also have division of society into the free, the Seir, and the unfree, the Dair people, done mostly on economic and social grounds. Everybody in early medieval Ireland belonged to a particular kin group, or finna, of which there are many different forms. So social position was defined by your legal status, and that was expressed in terms of an honour price, and different classes were divided on the basis of rank. Now, one of the central figures in political life in early medieval Ireland was the king, and there were different grades of kingship. Associated with the small or local tua, local kingdom, was the ri tua, the king of a tua. And as I said, when these grew powerful to control other tua, they are described as ri tua or ruri, the kings of over kingdoms. And then we go to the very highest level, the provincial kings, the ri chukid or ri ruach. So, as I say, at any given time, there could have been as many as 150 kings in Ireland, which seems a bit mad. But that means, of course, then there could be as many as 150 royal places associated with those kings. But again, we have to distinguish what we mean by a royal place, and also that there are different scales involved. Now, I'm not a historian, and I thought that probably came out very obviously in what I've just said. But as an archaeologist, of course, what I'll be trying to do is to match the archaeological record to the picture of early medieval Ireland revealed by the historical sources. Now, the period from the 6th, 7th century onwards sees a major expansion in Ireland of settlement. And this is represented archaeologically by the proliferation of small circular enclosures called ring forts, which take various forms, built in earth, the rath, or in their stone equivalents, the cashel. Now, these ring forts were built in great numbers between, I suppose, the 6th and the 10th century. That's their main period of construction. And it's estimated that originally there were as many as 60,000 of these, of which only approximately half now survive. So they are a very widespread settlement form, and they speak to the, the growth in settlement, the intensification of agriculture and industry, and the political life structure of early medieval Ireland in that period. So one of the challenges, I suppose, for archaeologists of the period is to try and relate ring fort settlement and other archaeological expressions of settlement to the political geography as expressed in the historical sources. And one of the things that we're trying to do in this project is to see, can we identify some of the royal sites of these kings on the ground? Now I want to turn to the southwestern part of Ireland, which is the province of Munster. And as the map here shows you, the main map shows you, this area, say around the 9th century, was divided up into a whole series of Tua and more Tua kingdoms and over kingdoms. And you can see here that the names of them are recorded by different historical sources. Now, the historical sources indicate that a group called the Ornot were the leading political and military power in Munster during the early medieval period. The Ornot were a loose federation of genealogically related dynasties that owe their origins to a man called Cork, or Conall Cork, who was the founder of Cashel in Tipperary around 400 AD. Now, the early origins, the origins and early history of the Ornot isn't very well understood because, again, we have a difficulty with analytic sources prior to the 6th century. Most scholars would agree that by the 8th century, Munster was divided into two broad political areas, Earmummel, or West Munster, and Ormummel, or East Munster. And the king of Cashel was a nominal king of the entire province, never fully attaining control of it. It's a federation, the Ornot, and their success, I suppose, from the 8th century onwards shows in their control of the kingship of Munster for several centuries. But they had major problems internally. Their internal politics was complicated in particular by a great division between the Western Ornot and the Eastern Ornot. Now, one of the two main groups in the Western Ornot were the Ornot Rathlin, also called the Eacoch Moon. And they were basically controlling a southern kingdom called Deshmumu. Now, that's shown there on the map and encircled in red there. Now, the Eacoch Moon, otherwise known as the Ornot Eacoch or Ornot Rathlin, they get their name from Oku, who was, Oku is a grandson of the legendary Cork. And there you can see a genealogical table on the far right there. Now, the Eacoch basically, by the 6th century, they divided into two distinct branches, the Kinel A and the Kinel Lera. And you can see that they had their eponymous ancestors there in the genealogical table, Lera and A. The Kinel A were one of the more powerful groups, and that's the group that we are particularly interested in respect of Garranes. One of their important figures was a man called Tiernoch, and he's associated with residents at Garranes, and his son is Philemid. And Philemid mac Tiernoch, who was the king of the Eacoch, is believed to have risen to become king of Munster in around 580 AD. Now, the Eacoch are a relatively minor grouping within the political federation of the Ornot, but from time to time, they did rise to positions of great importance. And one of those was in the 6th century, which is the period of great interest in our project. As we'll see, they also have a significance in later periods. Now, we turn to the area, the study area in question is the county of Cork. And in this map here, I just show you the distribution of known and surviving ring forts. And remember that the levels of site destruction are really very significant. So this is really just a map of survival. And you can see the location of Garranes, just there to the west of Cork City. Most of the dots on this map are represented by small univalent ring forts. Most of these ring forts were essentially enclosed family farmsteads. The word fort probably overstates any military function. They are defended residential enclosures, and most of them are connected with the strong farmers of the period, or what the text would call the Bo Ara or Ochara. But again, because of the different grades in society, the different classes in society, some ring forts are of more important people, the nemid or nobility. And then at the very highest end of the social ladder, we have the ring forts associated with kingly residents. And they, we believe, are distinguished by having multiple enclosures, not just one enclosing element, a bank or ditch, but in fact, bivalent or trivalent, or else distinguished by monumental architecture or size. And that is what we're going to be looking at. So we turn out to the subject of our study, which is Garranes, which is, as I say, 15 miles west of Cork City. And here in an area of very good agriculture today, there is a low ridge on top of which there are two prominent enclosures. Nishinogrena, literally meaning the fort of the city, or perhaps the fort of forts, and Monroe, possibly meaning the fort of the red-headed woman, or more likely the Irish Lisnomanreen, the Queen's Fort. So the Fort of Forts, perhaps, and the Queen's Fort, interesting place names to consider, and we might come back to that. So there you see there's their location, and they are the two central monuments in a complex of earthen ring forts and some other monuments that are a very particular cluster that draw attention to this area. If we look at historic mapping, on the left there we have an estate map from 1775 that shows the two great forts, Lisnocorra on the right and Lisnomonroe on the left. Interesting enough, the map by Bernard Scala follows the antiquarian convention of the time and refers to these as Danes' forts. In Ireland, all of these earthworks were basically associated with the Danes at different times in the 18th, early 19th century. Now, by the time of the first Ordnance Survey mapping of 1845, they've been given names by the Ordnance Survey, particularly by the team led by John O'Donovan. And the big fort is called Lisnocorra, and you can see that there's Lisnomonroe also. And you'll notice at the very top of that map on the right, there's also an earthwork called Shanawillan Karkin, the old mill of the fort of Kian. And we'll also come back to that. In the late 19th century, there were translations done by Owen MacNeill of medieval Bardic poetry. And one of the poems that he translated was a poem called Ra Rathlin, Ra Kirk is Kian. And that was basically a medieval poem, which we now know dates to the later medieval period, which is basically talks about this legendary place in Southwest Ireland associated with the residents of Cork and Kian, and it's called Ra Rathlin, believed to have been founded by Cork of Cashel, named Rathlin after his foster mother, but also associated, that was in the 5th century, and then in the 11th century associated with another legendary king called Kian. At the end of the 19th century, a local antiquarian called Canon Omani published papers in the local Cork Historic and Archaeological Journal. He said that he had identified the location of the legendary Ra Rathlin, the seat of Cork and Kian. And he associated this with a cluster of very large monuments in the parish of Temple Martin, which he basically interpreted as an ancient tribal city. Now, as part of our project, we commissioned one of our PhD students in Cork, Kian Kennelly, to do a translation of this medieval Bardic poetry. And another researcher, Leonora Fisher, did an interpretation of its political context in the later medieval period. And basically what they were able to show was that the poems are very much associated with a kind of mythologized understanding of the 5th, 6th century royal residents, and that they were written really for political purposes in the later medieval period. It's an interesting part of the book indeed. Now, one of the figures that is very much associated with Garranes is a king called Kian mac Maelmua, Kian, the son of Maelmua, who died in 1014. He was a king of the Éacach, and he's the son of Maelmua, who fell out with the Éacach at that time in the late 10th century. They fell out with a rising power in North Munster called the Dáil Gash. And essentially, the falling out led to basically war, and Maelmua was slain by a rising king of the Dáil Gash called Brian Boru. I should say he's my eponymous ancestor, but that would be to, have notions about myself. Anyway, so Brian Boru. Now, as part of the settlement of their war, Kian was forced to marry Brian's daughter, Sive. And later, Kian became an important ally of Brian's at the famous Battle of Clontarf in AD 14, when Brian Boru, of course, defeated the Norse-Irish alliance in the Dublin area, and the end of Viking power in Ireland, so to speak. Now, the question then is whether or not Garranes can be associated with Kian, because in the Bardic poetry, it is said to be the stronghold of Kian at that time. So that's one of the questions that we had to ask. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here, and this feeds into the place lore of the landscape. The local antiquarians, beginning with Canon Lines and this man Canon Omani in 1907, sought to try and look. They looked at the place lore of these medieval bardic poems, the so-called Dinhianicus poetry, and they tried to locate those places underground. And this is the kind of exercise, for example, that John O'Donovan did famously on the Hill of Tara much earlier. And here you can see in Canon Omani's publication of 1907 that he located what he believed to be Rathlin, which is the central fort, also known as Kian, the fort of Kian, or Cork, the fort of Cork. And then over to, you can see to the west of it, Dún Saibh, which is the fort of Saibh, who was married Kian. And of course, that is referred to now as Lisnaman Rua, which could mean Lisnaman Rian, the Queen's Fort. Canon Omani went further and then identified places also mentioned in the poems, such as the Rath of the Doorkeeper, that earthwork, that unusual linear earthwork, which some have suggested is a monumental entrance to the royal landscape. And then there are other forts were mentioned, the fort of the women, the fort of the Olav, the fort of the poets, and so on like this. Now, this exercise, of course, is very questionable. I mean, really, it was done very famously at Tara, but, there's very little, strict evidence to link any of those names to any of those places underground today. But nonetheless, like at Tara, this is where the names of the forts came from. So let's go back to perhaps more solid ground, if I may, the archaeology. Now, let me start by talking about the central fort at Garranes, which is Lisnacara, and there are its various names. This is a very large circular earthwork enclosure. It's trivalent, triple bank and ditch enclosure, 110 meters overall diameter, 67 meters internally with a single entrance. This is, you can see details of the enclosing elements today and a single entrance there. And the interior is essentially bare of features. Now, the investigation of this site really began it goes back to the 1930s, and it is very much a man called Jean-Pierre Riordan. Jean-Pierre Riordan was one of my predecessors as professor of archaeology in Cork. And in 1937, he did a one season in excavation at Garranes. And here he is with his team of excavators. Actually, the man three from the right on the front row is a student of his, or an apprentice of his, called Brian O'Kelly. And of course, he's very famous as the later Professor O'Kelly, who excavated Newgrange. Now, the Garranes excavation was a very large-scale excavation for its time. And in fact, I think I would very much link it to the beginnings of scientific excavation of ring forts in Ireland, for many reasons, not least the important evidence on chronology. So O'Riordan excavated, here's his plan, showing his trenches at the entrance, at the bottom, his trenches in the interior, and small trenches then across the enclosing elements. And here's just some photographs from the time showing one of his trenches across the enclosing elements, the tree, banks and ditch combinations. Here's his investigation of the entrance. And in the photograph in the bottom right, you can see that the men are standing in very large post holes, part of a series of 3 or 4 gates that protected the actual entrance itself. So this is a site which is it stands out from other ring forts, which tend to be really much smaller, maybe half the size, or univalid. Here we're looking at a site of considerable size, elaborate construction, elaborate defenses, But the defences are not very much military defences. These are more, this is a site that's showing off essentially. And there are clues from the early historical records that the status of a king was very much defined by the number of ramparts around his rath. And a triple ringed rath is very much, is recognised to be a site of high status. Now, in O'Riordan's excavation, one of the interior trenches, his so-called Site D, uncovered a great quantity of craftworking artefacts and debris. He found evidence for specialised crafts such as bronze casting, glass production, including millefiori glass, the working of enamel and amber, as well as some ironworking. Now, interesting enough, there are historical sources that go back to the 5th century, go back to I mentioned that king of Munster, Philomed Mac Tiernock. Well, Tiernock, his father, the historical sources talk about Tiernock having a master smith, a chief card, as it's called Amergen, who was the chief master smith at his royal residence. And of course, Amergen is the father of Saint Finbar, the patron saint of Cork. And for a long time, people believe that Saint Finbar was actually born in Garranes, Ringfort, but we know that's very unlikely to be the case. So goodbye, Saint Finbar. So back to Amergen. Well, going back to this, it seems that what O'Riordan found was evidence of a very specialised craft activity in this site. Now, in the initial publication, he said that this was probably some colony of specialist craft workers. And we know that these craft workers or card could rise to positions of considerable status. They were effectively Nemid nobility in that period. But in later publication, he saw it more likely that, in fact, what you had here were specialist craft workers working under the patronage of the king of the residence, of a kingly residence. So it's very much these specialists in working under kingly patronage. Now, the evidence that he found for this specialist craft, of course, here's just a small taste of the finds, the evidence of clay molds for bronze casting, the crucibles that were used in that process. There are small items of finished bronze work, not a lot, of course, but there's enough there to suggest on-site casting, of course, iron objects. There's a fair bit of glass beads and some pieces of worked amber. And there's also some interesting finds. For example, the one on the right is a little bronze tube that contains a rod of millefiori glass. It's like it's used as a kind of a glass dispenser. Very interesting find. But of course, what really stood out in his excavations was the discovery of pottery. Now, at this point, I just want to say, and some of you will be surprised by this, that Ireland in the first millennium AD, from late Iron Age, early centuries, to the end of the millennium, early medieval, was largely a ceramic. Now, with the exception towards the end of the millennium in Northern Ireland with Suturin ware, pottery was not produced in Ireland during the early medieval or indeed late Iron Age period. And that is really quite remarkable to have such a long period with no pottery production. But there was certainly interest in pottery because O'Riordan discovered significant amounts of imported pottery from the Roman world. Now, this fell into two groups. Pottery from the 5th, 6th century associated with imports from the East and Central Mediterranean and also possibly from North Africa. So he had different types of B amphora, East Mediterranean, and also A ware, what's known as Phoenician red slipware. He also found pottery which was slightly later in date, from the later 6th into the 7th century, and this is E ware from Gaul. Now, of course, scholars in Britain would be very familiar with this pottery from Tintagel and from other excavated sites there, and the work of Charles Thomas and those people. But Garranes, this was the first time this pottery had been discovered in Ireland, and it was very exciting because it came from historically dated context in the Roman world, which meant that for the first time, a scientific date could be given to a ring fort in Ireland. Became one of the first ring forts that could be positively dated in Ireland. The interesting thing is that it's not typical of Irish ring forts, most of which date from later centuries of the first millennium. Garranes is probably one of the earliest ring forts to be dated in Ireland, because we don't really have any evidence of prehistoric ring forts. Now, just jump forward to 1992. There was a second phase of excavation at Lisnacara, Garranes, when an independent researcher by the name of Mary O'Donnell excavated 3 trenches over that period. And there's the trench locations. Now, the most important find from her work was the discovery in one of the trenches of the ark of what could be a roundhouse. Now, this was important because one of the things that O'Riordan did not discover was evidence of houses inside the enclosure. Now, at the time, this pushed him in the direction of it being a specialized enclosure to do with craft working. But we now understand that he didn't identify those houses because of the excavation strategy, I suppose, he employed with narrow trenches, but also the significant damage caused to the interior by lazy bed potato cultivation of the early modern period. If you look at this photograph here, you can see the arc of charcoal stained foundation trench, but those broad linear features cutting across it are essentially potato lazy beds of the 19th century. And the entire interior of Lisnacara ring fort has been really very badly damaged by this cultivation. Mary O'Donnell was able to obtain some charcoal samples from a number of contexts, and we got the first radiocarbon dates. And as you can see, when you look at them there on the left, these mostly center on the 5th and 6th centuries. And that is very much confirming the evidence of the imported pottery. So now we come to our project, and the fieldwork part of that ran from 2011 to 2018. It began with a landscape geophysical survey undertaken by James O'Driscoll, who's now working at the University of Aberdeen. And James did this as part of his MPhil thesis here in Cork. After that then, myself and Nick Hogan led the excavation of 5 earthwork sites in the landscape. The central fort of Lisnacara, its adjacent fort of Monroe, and then 3 other sites, which I'll mention as well. And as I say, all of the findings have been brought together in this Archaeopress monograph. Our first one of our excavations is at Lisnacara. So in 2017, we went back to the big fort for 1 season. And here you can see the students in our MA in our Excavation program work project. And there you can see we excavated a very large trench, seen there in red, which was an extension of Mary O'Donnell's trench. And the whole point was to try and recover the full plan of that roundhouse structure that she may have discovered. In excavating that trench, underneath the bank slip, we also uncovered evidence of O'Riordan's black layer. And this is the layer that contained all the metalworking finds. And there you can see our excavation of it and the significant amount of crucible sherds, bronze waste, and tuya fragments from bronze casting. We were successful in being able to extend Mary O'Donnell's trench to identify its continuation and also of essentially a large roundhouse structure. This roundhouse, which is very badly damaged by the later cultivation, nonetheless, we are confident we have the outline of a building that was about 9 meters in diameter, 64 square meters internally. A very large structure, one of probably many that existed inside the enclosure in the 5th and 6th centuries. We also obtained our own series of radiocarbon dates from that and other contexts. And again, you can see they very clearly fall in the 5th and 6th centuries. And that is consistent with some of our pottery finds, which included the example shown here of B-ware and E-ware pottery. Much of our work at Garranes over 5 seasons, however, extended at the nearby site of Monroe, now a low relief circular earthwork, which we believe was a level site, but in fact was probably always fairly low relief. As I say, the place name literally means the fort of the red-headed woman, or probably the Queen's Fort, Lisnamanrian. Now, we began work at this with geophysical survey undertaken by James O'Driscoll, and then myself and Nick Hogan led excavation of the site over 5 seasons, 5 months of excavation in which we opened up those excavation trenches. All of this, again, undertaken as a student training projects. Once again, though, we discovered to our dismay that the interior of the enclosure was really decimated by this potato growing of the 19th century, which is a very significant problem in ring fort archaeology, because as circular enclosures, ring forts were often used as garden plots in this period. I digress now slightly to make the point that, in fact, while there's always been a kind of a belief in Ireland that ring forts were, always there until the modern period of agriculture destroyed them. Our study has shown that, in fact, there was enormous destruction of ring forts in this particular area in the 19th century. One of the contributions to the monograph is by Edward O'Riordan. And Edward did an analysis using estate maps, northern survey maps, and was able to show that of 28 recorded ring forts in that group of townlands in that part of the parish, only 3 of them survive today relatively intact. So in these areas of good agricultural potential, there's very high levels of site destruction, and that extends to the interior of even the sites that remain. Now, to go back to the archaeology here, the Monroe site is very different to Nishinogrena, which is a triple ring, a trivalent enclosure. So Monroe is very different. It's about 60 meters in diameter. It's surrounded by a very shallow flat bottom ditch, less than a meter in depth, inside which there is a very low bank, less than a meter, and a little light stake fence. And there in the top plan of Trench 2, you can get details of that there. If we go to the other side, to Trench 5, you can actually see the enclosing elements also, that flat bottom ditch and the remains of the bank inside. So it's a very slightly built enclosure, really not a bit defensive. There you can see details of the ditch, the bank area, and you can see the stake fencing on the inside. That gives you the kind of enclosing elements. Now, it has a single entrance located on the eastern side, facing the large Nishinogrena fort. That entrance is essentially a causewayed entrance, a break in the enclosing ditch, and then that leads into a single wooden gate, which is connected to the stake fence. So here's the details of the ditches terminals. And when we excavated these, we found some very interesting deposits of animal bone, but also some ewer and splinters of Roman period glass. This is detail of the actual stake fence joining with the post holes of the wooden gate. Now, moving to the interior of this enclosure, trenches 1, 4, and 6, once again, I have to point out the great damage caused by the cultivation of the modern period. But by searching carefully, we were able to identify truncated features from the early medieval habitation, stake holes, post holes, pits of different sorts. And some of these were clearly in a pattern to form a coherent structure. And in fact, we believe that we've been able to pick up the outline, admittedly very, very, very scant traces, but the outline of what we think is a large roundhouse structure in the interior. Now, while the interior was very badly disturbed, we did pick up a small but significant group of finds. And they were enough to show that this enclosure was not an animal enclosure, but was very much used for human residence. And indeed, high status residence at that. So we found evidence for textile production in these finds. And then we have these kind of luxury goods. It's really only fragmentary remains, but taken together, they're an interesting group. So we have evidence of imported Roman glass. We have evidence of imported pottery. Now, in this case, we have shards of E-ware, but also some shards of B-ware. So we have glass and an imported pottery from the 5th to early 7th centuries. We have a nice collection of early glass beads, bronze chain, scraps of sheet bronze, a bronze ring, and a bone comb fragment. Again, it really is very fragmentary evidence, but put together, it speaks to high status residents at the site. Our radiocarbon chronology for Monroe is very strong, as you can see here. There's a series of dates that we have, and we basically have got, through Bayesian modeling, we're able to get a kind of a date range centering really on about the 5th century AD. And when we compare those dates to the dates from Nishinogrena at the nearby enclosure, you can see that we are pretty certain that the two enclosures were occupied contemporaneously. And that's important because there was always the chance that one was replacing the other. So now what we have are these two great enclosures, with high status material culture associations occupied at this location in the 5th and 6th centuries AD. But interesting enough, apart from the eWare maybe going into the early 7th century, no evidence at either site of any post-7th century occupation. And I stress that in terms of any supposed associations with the 11th century King Kian. To push out now from these two central monuments, there's this site to the north called Karkin, covered today by trees, but essentially a sub-triangular earthwork with massive banks. Now, interesting enough, it's shown there, if you look at the map on the right, which is the Ordnance Survey of 1845, it's mentioned as Shanawilin Karkin, and that literally means the old mill of the fort of Kian. And there was a suggestion perhaps there that there might have been an early medieval horizontal mill. And indeed, we have mills of this early date in the Cork area. But if you look at the estate map of 1775, there's something very strange. It's not shown at all. And this is surprising because this is an immense earthwork. The earthwork is about 65 meters by 24 to 44 meters. The banks are up to 5 meters internal height. So it's sub-triangular, which seems to have an entrance at the lower southwestern end and leading into this kind of funnel-shaped enclosure. We did trench excavation in this, and what we discovered was that the earthwork, in fact, was probably built in the early modern period. We got a radiocarbon date from close to the primary cut. In the interior, the soil was quarried out to build the banks, was scooped out, if you like, and close to the primary cut, we got a late radiocarbon date, but we also got pottery finds of the early 19th century. We think that this earthwork was probably built sometime between Scal's map of 1775 and the Ordnance Survey of 1845, so around the early 1800s. What it was used for, we're not certain. My own best guess is that it's some kind of a cattle pound, but it certainly is not at all a ceremonial entrance to the Garranes landscape, to the royal landscape at Garranes, as had been suggested in the past. Now, moving out from these sites, we started to investigate some of the smaller ring forts in the area. And if you look at the bottom of the photograph here, circled in red, you can see one of these. So site 1 was Nishinogrena, site 2, Monroe. And then in red, we have this site, which is not being named. And this site is shown here on the different editions of the Ordnance Survey historic mapping as a univalid earthwork enclosure, probably a single bank and ditch small ring fort. And interesting enough, the 1943 map shows that it has a Suturin or underground tunnel system. Now, unfortunately, the site is nearly totally level today. And we were able to image some outline of it using gradiometry survey, as you can see here. And then we went in to do a single trench excavation in 2017. That wasn't very informative. Well, it was, I suppose. It confirmed the univalid defences of the enclosure. It didn't really recover very great dating evidence or finds, but we did get pre-bank charcoal at least to give us a terminus post quem, suggesting that this site is really towards the end of the first millennium, quite later in date from the aforementioned sites. Our next investigation, I suppose, our final excavation, was about 1 kilometre to the south of Nishinogrena, where we investigated a site called Nishinogrena, which literally means the little fort of the sun. And this is, again, seems to be a circular ring fort enclosure, about 40 to 50 metres diameter. On the various maps of the Ordnance Survey and the estate map, it's shown as essentially levelled at a very early date. But very importantly, the Ordnance Survey maps of the 20th century record the presence of an Olmstone at the site. Now, going into historical research, this is the record we have of an Olmstone that was discovered there around 1851. It was subsequently recorded by the antiquarian Richard Rold Brash, and there was even a small excavation done by the local priest antiquarian Reverend John Lyons, looking for more Olmstones. And this is the Olmstone itself, which is presently in our collection here in University College Cork. And the inscription, of course, reads, Casitas Maki Muki Kaliti, casitas of the tribal people of the Keliti. Now, I won't go into Olmstones in any detail, but for those of you that aren't familiar with it, this is the earliest form of writing, of literacy, based on Latin literacy, I suppose, but the earliest form of the Old Irish language, found in monumental form on stones dating to probably the 5th to 7th centuries AD. Some would argue maybe going back to even the 4th century. They are found in different contexts, but in the Cork area, they are particularly found buried underground in Suturins, which is not necessarily their primary context. What makes them very important is that they are memorial stones. And in this particular case, an important person, probably of the 5th or 6th century, is recorded. And his name is Casitas, and he is of the tribal group, we call it tribal group, the Keliti. And we might come back to that. Now, this is our investigation of the site. Again, our survey shows very low relief outline of a circular enclosure. That's imaged a bit better on the resistivity, top right, and the the gradiometry survey, bottom right. So we did a large trench excavation in 2018. We were able to identify the outer ditch, the residual bank, and an inner ditch of an enclosure. And then we were also able to investigate the interior of the enclosure and pick up some traces of occupation in the form of burnt spreads. Now, the outer ditch and the bank, this would be typical of an Irish ring fort. The inner ditch, however, was a bit more perplexing, and it proved that eventually we discovered that, in fact, this is a 2-period monument. And as we'll see, it's a monument that has a very interesting history. So here's details of our excavation of the enclosing element and the interior. And one of the features that we discovered in the interior was a very large pit, which is a construction shaft for an underground tunnel system, or Suturin. We discovered the entrance to one of the Suturins. There are probably several Suturins at the site. And we also discovered some of the robber pits from Reverend Lynes's antiquarian dig in the late 19th century, looking for more Olmstones. We excavated some of the underground tunnel system, where we got good radiocarbon dating samples and also a nice glass bead find. And we were able to look at the construction of methods used in these Suturins. These Suturins, while the majority of Irish Suturins, I should say, are stone built, the Suturins in the Cork area, the great majority, are actually burrow type, a bit like rabbit burrows, but more sophisticated, involving construction shafts and everything. Now, the radiocarbon chronology from Nishinogrena is interesting in that the dates for the inner ditch go back to approximately the 6th century. And we think that there would have been a ditched enclosure there at that time, and that possibly the Olmstone was an open air display. If you look at the top right image, you'll see the gradiometry survey, and those 4 arrows show the magnetic readings for the inner ditch feature. Then the ring fort was rebuilt, and as the radiocarbon dates show you, that probably happened in the 9th century. At that point, the inner ditch was infilled, and a more substantial outer ditch with bank was built. And also, Suturins were constructed. And it was at that time that the Olmstone was buried underground. This phenomenon of burying Olmstones underground in Suturins is very interesting. And, we're not entirely sure why it happens. Some people believe it is, almost a religious act. It could be to do with the suppression of genealogical memory. It has political overtones, etc. Interesting enough, in this area, we actually have, many other Suturins. And when we were doing our project in 2018, a local farmer conveniently found a Suturin for us when his machine fell into it, and we were able to get radiocarbon dates for it. The whole landscape, there are literally hundreds of these Suturins. And as I say, they mostly date from the end of the millennium. So now I'm ready to wrap up, really, and I just want to wrap up with these points here. The contention is that the monument complex that I've shown you is the legendary Ratloo, the royal landscape of the early medieval period in this part of mid-Cork, associated with the Eacalc. Now, when we call it a royal site, we just have to put that, we have to say, why is it a royal site? And a bit of background here. The study of royal sites is a very big area of research in Ireland, particularly associated with the Iron Age. And of course, we talk about the big four. We talk about Owen Macha, Navan Fort. We talk about Cruachan, Rathcruachan, Dún Ailíne, and of course, the legendary Tara. And these are these great late prehistoric, protohistoric royal landscapes, which have long history going back to the Neolithic period. And that they are very much, they're a different type of royal site. There's no comparison with what I've been showing you. I've been showing you a kind of a minor royal site associated with a petty kingdom of the early medieval period. What makes it a royal site? Well, I think the excavation records provide evidence of high status occupation. I mean, the importation of material culture from the Roman world is very significant. We don't find that material culture on the small ring forts of the early medieval period. The size of the enclosures at Lisnacora, with its 3 rings, that's a very strong status signifier. The size of these 2 enclosures and the fact that they were occupied contemporaneously. The evidence, so all of that fits together. Size, construction, the multivalation, the evidence of material wealth, overseas trade, and of course the specialist craft working, because crafts like bronze and glass and enamel production, they're not associated with ordinary ringfort farmsteads. So the archaeology does speak very strongly to elite residents, and the radiocarbon chronology and pottery evidence speaks to the 5th and 6th century occupation. I would say there's every possibility that this site was a royal residence of Philemid Mac Tiarnach, king of the Éacach in that area, who rose to great power at the end of the 6th century to become the king of Cashel, king of Munster in effect. Now, in the landscape, we also have evidence of continued ringfort settlement into the 1st millennium AD, but no evidence of elite residents that we could associate with the legendary King Kian or his wife, Saive. We have no evidence that we could connect to, for example, another Éacach king of Munster, Dum Dabron, or indeed to Maelmua. So that's very interesting. And then we have to ask, well, the medieval Bardic poetry, we come back to that. We come back to the idea that this, by the end of the millennium, this has become a mythologized landscape. And some would say that possibly it is a place of assembly, possibly even Enoch assembly. So to conclude, really, the results of this study confirm that, or strongly indicate, that Garranes was an important settlement in southwest Ireland during the 5th and 6th centuries. The status of this minor royal residence, or Rira, is indicated by the size and design of its 2 large adjacent enclosures, both of them very much consistent with Nemid residence, probably that of a petty kingdom, Ritua. I mean, this is supported, as I say, by their size, their type of construction, multivalation, and specialist craft evidence. The wealth of the settlement, again, to come back to the Roman connection, that the importance of the settlement is really indicated by this quantity of pottery and glass vessels from the Mediterranean region and later from Atlantic France, associated with the importation of wine and other exotic goods. That trade began in the 5th century at a time when Roman merchants were familiar with the Cork coastline. And the demand for such goods at Garranes seems to indicate a desire, if you like, to acquire the material culture of the Roman Empire. An expression of Romanitas probably also represented in the development of Ogham writing in this area in the same period. A lot of this paved the way for the spread of Christianity to southwest Ireland, to the Palladian mission of the early 5th century. And it's possible that one of the early converts was the king of this powerful Tua in mid-Cork, a Tua that we call in later sources the Éacach. Maybe the Olmstone records suggest they should be called the Calisi. Their royal seat seems to have been this pair of large enclosures, Ra Rathlin, which is memorialized, I suppose, in the Bardic poetry of the later medieval period. So at that point, I just want to end by a bit of a plug for the monograph. And again, this isn't necessarily anything financial, because with the support of Archaeopress, The book, of course, which is a very fine production by Archaeopress, leaving aside its content, but it's a very fine hardback production. But it's also available free to download on the Archaeopress website. And so with that, again, I'd like to thank you all for attending this talk. And again, a big shout out to Archaeopress for all they're doing for research archaeologists like myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to, we should both be visible now. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Billy. That's fantastic. And it's always strange when we come to the end of these because we can't see or hear the audience, but I'm going to give you a little round of applause on behalf of absolutely everyone, because that really was fantastic. Thank you. Now we've got time for some questions. I think I've got a few starting to come in. So if you'd like to ask a question now, do either use the, if you could try and use the Q&A function. Some are coming in the chat as well. So I'll try and keep an eye on both. And I will do my best now to pass them on. I'm going to apologize in advance if I do badly with some of the pronunciations.
Oh, you're okay.
So firstly, we've got Margaret Cormack asking, what were the Suturins primarily used for?
Well, this is much debated. Essentially, I think that they have multiple uses depending on the situation. They would have had very much a cold storage function in a kind of a farming, dairy farming economy. But there's no doubt that their design is much more than that and speaks to their use as places of refuge. A lot of the warfare of this period took the form of raiding. And so children, for example, valuables, would be put underground at times of raiding. And so, they're a form of protection as much as anything. I don't think that they have any other connection in religious terms or anything like that.
I'm nodding and reading at the same time as the questions come in. Thank you. Michelle Kuma says, thank you very much for the talk. And early medieval rural settlements often display a connection with prehistoric sites, particularly burials and ritual monuments. Where are the nearest known prehistoric sites in this landscape?
Okay, well, Michelle Comber, of course, I have to say to you, is one of the contributors to this book. And there are many contributors. And again, I've been neglectful by not mentioning all of them. In the book, Michelle contributes a very important study of the ring fort settlement landscape of that study area, where she looks at other ring forts in the area and does a kind of a spatial analysis of them in respect of social hierarchy in the period. So thank you for that. Now, Michelle basically draws attention to the fact that there are no prehistoric sites actually at Garranes. And that is one of the things that would set it apart from, say, the late prehistoric royal sites, obviously, like places like Tara. So we don't actually have prehistoric sites at Garranes, but in the surrounding landscape, within the vicinity of kilometres, there would, of course, be a background distribution of Bronze Age settlement in the period. The Iron Age is a period that is not archaeologically visible at all. 5 kilometres away from Garranes is the great late Bronze Age hill fort of Clashin Imud, which was built around 1100 BC and destroyed soon afterwards in Bronze Age warfare. But why did they build at Garranes? There doesn't seem to be any reason why the place had a special significance for the builders. And it's interesting that if you go back into the origin legends of Cork of Cashel, that the building of Garranes in these legends is associated with a southward spread of Conall Cork and his Ornot power into South Munster, and the establishment dedicated to his foster mother Rathlin of this outlying fort. And so, perhaps that's the reason why there isn't any prehistoric sites known at the location.
Fantastic, thank you. I can't see who's asked this one. Anonymous asks, is there any connection between the Millefiori glass and glass in the Ballandary brooch? Yes,
yeah, that's interesting in that the monograph contains a number of specialist studies, and I think there's a specialist study on our discovery of glass beads, but I have to say that we haven't done any specialist study of the Millefiori at all. That said, the monograph has a very important contribution from 2 Spanish archaeologists, Ignacio Montero and Mercedes Murillo, and they have done an in-depth study of the non-ferrous metalworking at the site. And Ignacio and Mercedes have done a really important technical scientific study, because we have very few of those for the early medieval period, and they've been looking at the bronze casting and all of that. Back to the Millefiori question, no, there's no specific connection to the Ballanderi brooch at all. We've explored a number of these. I mean, one of the connections we tried to explore was between Garranes, the non-ferrous metalworking at Garranes, and the early medieval copper mine at Ross Island, Killarney. And with the help of Sophie Stoss-Gale, we were able to use lead isotope analysis. And while the results are really very preliminary, we couldn't make a connection to that early medieval copper mine. But I think your question very much makes the point that there's a lot more research to be done in all of this. I should say, by the way, that this entire project never received a single research grant. And for that reason, it was a bit constrained in some of the, perhaps some of the specialist work it could have done. And again, that speaks again very much to the support from Archaeopress to bring it to publication. But I can see a new generation of research definitely in the future.
Fantastic. What may have led to the abandonment of Garranes?
Yes, the archaeological evidence of the two big enclosures shows very clearly that they were abandoned sometime around the end of the 6th century. And we don't know why. And it's interestingly, they were not reoccupied, even though they went on to acquire a special significance in later medieval Bardic poetry. But as I say, that's part of a mythologizing and memorializing of a landscape. One could probably associate that abandonment with the political upheavals, maybe, of the 7th to 8th century. I mean, by the 8th century, there was a lot of centralizing tendencies, I think, in the political geography of Munster, with the rise of over-kingdoms and the assertion of more centralized political power. And some of these local kingdoms may have suffered as a consequence. And it might just be that, the political, that the Éacoch themselves may have moved to a new centre for kingly residence. But no, we cannot, I should say, however, in any way link the abandonment to any destruction horizon in the sites, to any act of warfare. It's just not historically documented. But it is interesting that it happens very suddenly at the end of the 6th century.
Thank you. That was, I should have said that was from Jackie Brennan, that one. So thank you, Jackie. We're nearly at the end of the questions. So if people want to ask anything, then now's the time. Do send them through. Tony Camden, so he starts with a lovely bit of praise. Great distillation of a huge period of work into an hour, Billy. He said, and he says, of the final aerial photo, can you comment on what appears to be a defined area where these sites exist? Is this the ridge?
The final aerial photograph?
Yes.
Oh, well, yes, that is the ridge. Yeah, sorry, excuse me, Tony. Yes, indeed. There's no evidence of any outer enclosure, if that's what suggests. That's topography, essentially, yeah.
Right.
And again, I think that would have been picked up. James O'Driscoll's blanket geophysical survey, it was very interesting because it picked up some possible enclosures, or sorry, some possible perhaps ring ditches or hut sites, but none of these are very convincing, I think, really, and need to be confirmed by excavation. I suppose that one of the most important parts of his study was the fact that he was able to rule out the presence of significant prehistoric archaeology in the area, at least.
Mm. And Brandy Steer asks, is there any indication of where they moved in the 7th to 8th century?
Well, again, the study that in the monograph produced by Michel Comber, which looks at contemporary and later ring fort settlement in mid-Cork, shows numerous possibilities. Not long after he excavated at Garranes, Professor Reardon excavated a similar tri-valet fort near the Cork coast called Ballycatteen, occupied no B-ware imported pottery associations, but E-ware in abundance, suggesting occupation from the 7th, 8th into the 10th centuries with its Suturin complexes. So we have at least one site in the same area, which would be in the territory of the Éacoch, that could be a place that they could have moved to. It's called Ballycatteen near Ballinspittle in County Cork. I should also say that we made efforts to do environmental research in the project, And with the help of Dr. Tim Mile of the University of Aberdeen, we did pollen coring in a bog close to, only about a kilometre away from these sites. But that was unsuccessful because the bog itself unfortunately proved to be cut over, and we weren't able to get a proper pollen or vegetation record for this period. And I think that's what was one of the disappointing aspects of the project, that the landscape itself has very poor opportunities for pollen sampling. And so that's something, again, for future research.
Sure, thank you. We've got one actually from our own Riker from Archaeopress. You mentioned that the forts were not primarily military in that sense, but was there evidence of conflict between the kingships?
Well, indeed, that evidence for this period mostly comes from annalistic records. And now, again, these can overstate the situation. This is clearly not a period of endemic warfare, but it's a period of considerable political tension. I mean, throughout the early medieval period, we see that political tensions exist between these petty kingdoms. The fragmentation of the political scene gave rise to constant and outbreaks of warfare, though perhaps a lot of that warfare is more at the level of raiding activity. And that, of course, explains then the need for, explicit features of defense in residential settlement. The ring fort, in other words, is a product of its times, of its troubled times.
And we've got an anonymous question. Why is it considered unlikely that St. Finbar was born there?
Well, I think that's based on historical sources. One of our great scholars in Cork, Professor Pottery, did a study of the historical sources that basically he looked into the whole St. Finbar mythology and questioned indeed the very association of St. Finbar with Cork itself, and that he was born in another part of the country. But it was more a legendary association to begin with, and when you drill into the historical records, it just can't be substantiated.
Sure. And I think last one, unless anyone has some late submissions, what was the landscape like at the time? Do we have much evidence of that?
Yes, well, that comes back to this difficulty we have with the vegetation records, that in the mid-Cork area, we have very poor pollen records. I mean, we're much better served when we get into the peninsulas of the southwest, which is, of course, the bogland, the upland bogland landscapes. But in this area, we really have a very poor local vegetation record. Now, in terms of the big picture regionally, well, what we see is that we are dealing with landscapes that are much more heavily wooded, but we are also looking that the rise of the ring fort from the 6th century onwards is coinciding with agricultural intensification, and that's impacting on woodland. There's more and more clearance, and there's also much more evidence for mixtures of arable and pastoral agriculture. I mean, early medieval Ireland is a very rural, obviously very agricultural society, and farming practices is to the fore in the economy. All of the material wealth of these places, of Rathlin, is underpinned by very strong agricultural economy. But in terms of reconstructing the environment, it's quite difficult at the local level unless we get pollen records going forward.
Right. And I think last question. Oh no, couple keep popping in. Are you okay to carry on for a bit?
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, super. So Deirdre Cosgrove asks, so you mentioned that the Iron Age is invisible, but how do you know that some of those thousands of unexcavated ring forts aren't earlier?
Yes. Well, I suppose at this stage, we've excavated a very large number of ring forts in Ireland. I would say it must be coming close to the 1,000 mark. I don't have an exact figure now, to be honest. But we have certainly hundreds and hundreds of ring forts have been excavated, perhaps not 1,000. And many of those have been scientifically dated. Now, in the earlier days, it was difficulty. Garranes ring fort stood out because of its pottery association, but in the pre-radiocarbon dating era, not so easy to date these sites. Where they've been dated and where we've done proper source criticism of the dating context, we can't find any ring forts that have secure dating in Ireland in the Iron Age. Now, it has been suggested, and indeed multivelation in terms of earthwork enclosure, thanks to the work of people like Ger Dowling, has definitely got its origins in the prehistoric period. But the classic ring fort type seems to be largely absent from the range of ditched enclosures and other enclosures that we've found on recent road scheme archaeology in the Irish Iron Age. So, you know, it's not impossible, of course. And again, we might also be dealing with ring forts that could have had earlier Iron Age occupation, but very much the ring fort itself seems to be a settlement form associated with a very new period of human settlement and agriculture in Ireland in the early medieval period. And likewise, the ring fort itself, eventually by the 9th century, earthen ring forts are very much in decline. The stone-built ring fort continues, but the later history of the ring fort as you go into later medieval times is really, again, not about primary construction, but in most cases about secondary use of earlier sites. But we do have Michelle Comber is actually, a bit of a shout out here. If Michelle is still on the line, one of the most exciting ring fort projects being undertaken in Ireland at the present time is in the Burn landscape in Western Ireland in County Clare. And in that amazing landscape, Michelle, for many years, has been excavating Carconnell Stone Fort, which is a stone fort that goes really from the 9th century to the 12th and later centuries. And it's a remarkable example of a late cashel, very much a place of high status residence, of importance. And I think that is currently one of the most exciting projects of this type being undertaken in Ireland.
Oh, fantastic. Good shout out. So John O'Keefe starts with a nice comment. Super discussion of a really interesting collection of sites. Given the loss of sites in the area due to agriculture, is there any indication of this collection of sites being seen or preserved as historic monuments in the past? First millennium as well as now? Is the agricultural loss only post-medieval or any evidence of later medieval destruction in agriculture?
Well, I think that the evidence we have is that it's very much early modern, because we are very fortunate in this area. I mean, for many parts of Ireland, we're reliant on our first ordnance survey maps, and which date to the 1840s. But in this area, we have a very detailed private estate mapping of 1775, which shows significant numbers of ring forts, which are then gone by the time you get to the end of the 19th century. So we think that a lot of the ring fort archaeology was relatively intact until you come into the 19th century. And the 19th century seems to have been a period of great ring fort destruction in this area. Now, the surviving sites, of course, are protected by the National Monument Act. But as I say, the loss of archaeology has been very significant.
Yeah. Nancy Murphy asks, how many people would generally live in Garranes?
Well, in the early medieval period, it's been suggested that there might have been at any time as many as 150 tua, or, if you like, petty kingdoms in Ireland. And the population estimates widely, but it's often suggested that a tua, such as this one, we're suggesting that these sites are at the center of a petty kingdom or tua. There might have been as many as 5,000 people living in that territory. At the ring fort itself, of course, the numbers would have been much smaller. You're talking about kingly residents, the royal family and retinue, servants, etc., a population of slaves, the outlying forts. But again, remember, it's a palimpsestic landscape. That image of all these forts, they're not all the same date. And of course, that makes any kind of analysis on a spatial geographical side very problematic, because it is a palimpsest. Mm-hmm. But I would say that the population of Ireland in this period was probably not in excess of 500,000. But again, the figures here, I wouldn't be an expert on that. One other point I wanted to just throw in there, as I was acknowledging all the great support we got pro bono from so many specialists. I also want to thank very much Ian Doyle of the Heritage Council in Ireland, another one of our Cork graduates, and he contributed the study on the imported Roman pottery to the project. And he has been working for many years on imported Roman pottery, and he began his research looking at O'Rear Dawn's material from Garranes, and he was able to really do a good study for us on the pottery. So thanks to Ian as well.
Yeah, thank you. Good, yes, as you say, good shout out. Michelle, thanks you for the shout out for her. And Richard O'Brien asks, he says, congratulations first on a great project. And then, did your excavations at Garranes produce much faunal remains?
Now, and thank you for that again, because there's so many people to kind of acknowledge for work. The answer, Richard, and I know Richard, of course, personally. Richard is, of course, a specialist on his research here, also in UCC, I think, was on early medieval textile production and spindle whorls. So he'd have an interest in some of the material from Lisna Monroe. But back to your question, unfortunately, the preservation, as you saw from the two big enclosures, was not great. We have the problem of the early modern potato cultivation, and then we have the problem of acidic soils. So bone preservation was very poor. But it must be said that from Lisna Monroe, we were able to recover a small quantity of burnt bone, which was studied by one of our PhD students here in Cork, Roisin Nikinaveen. And Roisin is an upcoming archaeozoologist who's doing a major study on the animal bone assemblage from Michel Comber's site at Karkin in Clare. Now, Roisin was able to look at the fragments of animal bone from Lisna Monroe and was able to identify cattle. And essentially, it's a residue, food residues really from a farming economy. But we can't really say a lot more than that. Obviously, cattle are by far the most important animal in this period. But of course, you're also talking about a time in which sheep and pigs, goats were also farmed.
Thank you. And I think we've reached our final question. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you for the pronunciation of the, who was the man described in, sorry, it's Oghan.
Oh, that's Om or Ogham.
Sorry.
That's the name of the writing.
Yeah, so who was the man described?
Ogham is actually the name of that writing on the stone, yes.
Right, yeah, sorry. So yes, Anne-Marie Scott, who was the man described in the writing?
Oh, yes. Well, again, you see, like it is the early medieval period in the 5th, 6th century, but you might as well be in prehistory because we don't have the sources that can connect, any person, any individual to any of this archaeology. I mean, we can make a strong case that, for example, a king like Philomed Mac Tiernach had his royal residence, but we don't actually have any record of who Casitas is the man mentioned in that Ogham inscription. He was obviously an important person of that tribe of the Kiliti. And again, the burial of his memorial stone is interesting in terms of the suppression of that genealogical memory, and may be to do with the fact that the power that was based there at Garranes, which ended around the 6th century, that by the time you get to the building of the Olmstones in the 9th century, the building of the Suturins in the 9th century, that there's a removal of the landscape of the earlier political associations. It's kind of interesting stuff there.
Yes, great. And I'm going to say sorry to Anne for my mangling of reading out her question.
No, not at all. And by the way, I also want to acknowledge the very important part of our work really is the radiocarbon chronology for a lot of this. And they very much recognise the support of Kevin Carney, who did the Bayesian analysis for us.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, thank you. It is great to give shout outs to all these people, because when the book first came out, we had a lovely response from people past and present who'd worked on it. So yes, it's really nice to hear all their names tonight. I think that wraps us up. So I really want to say a huge thank you to you, Billy, for taking the time out to not just give us the fantastic presentation, but then to answer all the questions so thoroughly as well. So on behalf of everyone, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you very much. It really was great fun, and I'm going to go off now and have a drink with myself. So yeah, thank you very much, and
good on you.
Major thanks to Archaeopress, who made it all happen in the end. Thank you.
No, you're very welcome. I'm going to end the meeting for everyone. So thank you very much for attending. It's been really lovely to have such a dedicated audience. We've had some really nice messages, which we really appreciate, and fantastic questions. So I'm going to say good night to everybody, and I'm going to log us all off. So thanks very much. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.